Okay, well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamara Ecker, Managing Director of British American Business, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to one of the first events of our fall 2024 programming season. Very briefly, for those of you not familiar with BAB, we are the leading transatlantic business association supporting companies with operations in both the US and the UK markets. We run regular programs on themes impacting our member companies, both virtual and in person, all with a backdrop of US-UK connectivity and nuance. Today's theme, the importance of employee value proposition, which of course then translates to retention, among other things, has clearly resonated with our network, and I'm pleased to see such a fantastic turnout on this Zoom meeting. So thank you to everyone on this call for spending part of your day with BAB. We do have a large panel today, and I want to allow as much time as possible for their perspective, so we are going to get right to it. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Gabby Joyner, Head of Great Britain and Head of Employee Experience Consulting for Europe with WTW, who have been just such incredible partners and sponsors of this series on employee engagement. So Gabby, right over to you.
Thank you so much, Tamara. And just checking everyone can hear me okay?
Yeah.
As Tamara said, I'm Gabby Joyner and I lead WTW in GB, as well as leading our employee experience business across Europe. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Jared Bazilan from Cushman & Wakefield, Kath Possamai from Amazon, Tom State from Microsoft, and one of my WTW colleagues, Imran Qureshi. And as we get into the discussion, I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves as they speak, as that will save us some time, I think. In terms of timing for today, we're going to spend, as Tamara said, about 35 minutes on discussion before opening the floor to questions with yourselves as participants. So please use the raise your hand feature within about the last 15 minutes of the session, depending on how we're going. We may pick up on some questions earlier than that, but if you put them into the chat. Otherwise, if you want to ask a question verbally, then please use the raise your hand feature in the last 15 minutes. And just a plea to everyone on this session, please do keep your microphones on mute when you're not speaking so that we can avoid any background noise. So with that, let's get on with the session. And thank you all so much for joining us today as we dive into the world of the employee value proposition, commonly referred to as the EVP. We're going to uncover today how developing and defining an employee value proposition for your organization can truly be a differentiator. And we'll provide valuable and practical insights on how a robust EVP can significantly elevate your business performance and employee experience. So just thinking about that, why EVP and why now? I think an ever-accelerating rate of change over the last few years has been forcing organizations to embark on significant transformation programs. And adding to this, the enduring global issues that we're seeing, like the ever-growing competition for talent, for many an increasingly disparate workforce from hybrid working, the need often to expand the employee offer beyond compensation due to the need to optimize costs, and continuing economic and technological disruption. All of these things and prompting organizations to find different ways to differentiate themselves, namely by focusing on the employee experience they want to deliver. It's requiring organizations to be really agile in how they win the hearts and minds of their people. And this is where the EVP comes in. An EVP is not the flavor of the day or the newest buzzword. When it's done well, it's really the driving force behind an organization's employee experience, which we know has a direct correlation to business impact and financial performance. And the power of that EVP shouldn't be underestimated. Employees' perceptions of employers, who they are, and the experiences they offer form well before they join the organization, and they will continue until they leave and beyond. And so this relationship between the employee and the employer will be constantly influenced and shaped by touch points during their day-to-day working. And it's within these touch points that your EVP lies. And the EVP helps you be intentional on how you deliver on these experiences, the big milestone moments and everything in between. through our research and work with clients, we're seeing that the way employers and employees view the employee value proposition is changing. We're seeing a bit of a paradigm shift in employee expectations, which is requiring employees to really rethink the way they construct, communicate, and deliver on their EVP. If we think back to before the pandemic, I think what we used to see is that the employee value proposition was primarily centered on what employees could offer and what they would expect from employees in return. You could say it was quite a transactional proposition. And I think what we're seeing now is a shift from that transactional proposition, which I think we used to refer to as the give and the get, to a proposition that articulates a more differentiated experience. And while there are still fundamental elements of the give and the get needed to deliver within the EVP, for example, total rewards, a very tangible aspect, how employees experience work is now equally or even more important as what they gain in the relationship between employee and employer. And likewise, employers are increasingly aware of the relationship between strong employee experience and strong financial outcome, and are using EVPs as a differentiator as they compete for talent, strive to decrease undesired employee turnover, and increase employee engagement. So with that said, let's hear from some of these organizations regarding how they're delivering their EVPs. And firstly, I'm going to turn to Imran, if that's okay. Imran, from your experience and in your opinion, why should organizations design and execute on an EVP? Where have you seen that really have an impact?
Great. Thanks, Gabby. Just by way of introduction, Imran Qureshi, I lead North America for WTW. I'm based in Chicago, but born and raised in London, and crossed the tipping point of spending more years of my life in Chicago than I did at my birth town. I also lead a global business called Integrating Global Solutions. So I want to respond to this question that you just raised, Gabby, on a personal basis to start with. So my son just graduated recently from university in Washington, D.C., and he is embarking upon entering the work world for the first time. And we had a really interesting discussion about what he's looking for in an employer and the kind of environment that he's looking to work in. So it's not just about the role, but it's about the environment that he's in. And we had this discussion, and it was pretty intense, and we talked about sort of the forces that are influencing that decision that he is experiencing as a confluence of different things. So I'm going to go a level deeper just briefly on what you said, Gabby. So we've seen a confluence and magnitude of disruptions, whether it be climate change, social strains, the economy, geopolitical risks. As we've seen more people heading to the polls in at least 64 countries, about 49% of the world's population this year. But guess what? Despite all of that, Edelman's Trust Barometer still places employers as more trusted than any other institution. We're also seeing organizations are dealing with transformation. M&A is starting to pick up. And with the interest rate drop in the United States just most recently, yesterday, we're expecting 2025 to see even more M&A activity, which will cause disruption. And obviously, transformation in technology, AI, new ways of working, and consumer expectations around sustainability. And then the final force is around shifting labor trends. So we've seen declining labor supply, and boomers are continuing to retire. And net immigration is impacting many countries. And by some accounts, it's going to take at least a decade for the boomers to be replaced by the next generation, which is Generation Alpha, and those born between 2010 and 2024. And then you've got the rise of the employee voice and social media, pay transparency and pay equity. So it's a confluence of those forces. And my son's basically saying that's a lot that we're dealing with as a Generation Z entering this workforce. But it's so important, therefore, for the employer to define the employee value proposition. And maybe that's a good launching point for the next question.
Absolutely. And just on that, Imran, I think absolutely it just makes the employee value proposition even more important and even more relevant, I think. So over to you, Jared, in terms of we mentioned that we're seeing this paradigm shift, and Imran's just added to that in terms of just the amount of forces hitting on, you know, people entering the workforce today, but also people who've been in the workforce for a period of time. You know, the amount of change that we're seeing is quite significant. How are you seeing this evolution in your organization, and how are you picking up on these ever changing forces that organizations need to manage and still continue to differentiate themselves?
Yeah, you know, I think that you made an interesting point earlier around the relationship between organizations and employees. And I think, you know, recruiting and retention, especially for great talent right now in competitive job markets, is really important. But going back to your point on the relationship traditionally has been relatively transactional, right? And I think that when you think about what your differentiators are to recruit and retain, you know, the days of like employees receiving pensions in the private sector is no longer, right? So when you look at what is important to employees, compensation definitely being one of them. But you know, I think the traditional relationship is becoming more parodied, and the impact of things like compensation on retention, for example, has diminished. So what we've done is we've spent a lot of time listening to employees to find out, as well as leaders to find out, you know, what really matters to employees, because I think that's a starting point in really finding out what you should focus on in the organization, to kind of evolve with the expectations of the employees in this type of environment. And what we found is that, to Imran's point earlier, you know, there's a connection here that employees are looking for, a couple of things. And for us, it's purpose in their work, and they want to know that they're having an impact on the business. They're looking for growth and development opportunities, which for us is a really big focal point right now. In addition to other things like well-being and having a community of belonging, and then recognition for the work that they're doing. So what we've done to kind of evolve this is really starting out with listening sessions, and making sure that we're creating a culture of feedback, because as the workforce changes, we need to be active listeners and understanding what they're continuing to look for. And I think, Gabby, you made a good point a minute ago around, you know, it's not just the incoming workforce, the new generation of workers, it's also the evolution of what our current workers who have been in the workforce for a while are also now wanting, that maybe was not the case, you know, 10 years ago. So we're trying to focus on a couple of those areas. We're really focusing right now on making sure that we have purpose, that there's a purpose that aligns what the employees are looking for, and what we're positioning as our employee value proposition to the organizational values. I think that's really important for the company to have alignment with what we're providing for the employees internally as well. And then again, we're investing a lot in our development opportunities. We're a very matrixed organization here at Cushman. We have offices all over the globe. We have 52,000 employees. And so it's important that we're able to provide opportunities across all of our service lines, and really leverage the fact that we're matrix to provide growth and development within the organization. And then, you know, we're also focusing on things like creating an inclusive workforce that's inclusive, that we have those communities internally where folks feel comfortable, they are able to participate and build in a large organization. And sometimes that can be difficult. But I will say probably the biggest change, I think, around employee value proposition for us has really been making sure that, you know, I think when you think about the life cycle of an employee, we have I think a lot of companies do a great job of marketing an EVP to candidates, to recruits. But when you talk about how to actually retain employees when they are in the organization and throughout their life cycle with the organization, I think the biggest takeaway is how you integrate that value proposition into your day to day. And so you have to deliver it every day. I think we have to spend time developing managers and leaders on prioritizing these things and making sure that it's built into our business plan. It's not just a talent strategy, but it's also a business strategy. And so we have really spent quite a bit of time, I think, finding ways to do that. So,
Amazing.
and yeah, and we've had some good feedback on it. So it's active listening, even after some of the work gets put in place. I think it's continued listening.
Great. And I think to your point, listening is so critical. And that there's a couple of questions I'm burning to ask as follow-ons from that. One which I'm going to direct to Tom, which is about, you know, how, so you mentioned integrating it into the day-to-day of the organization, Jared, but you also referenced my point around the fact that there are different segments of the population. And Tom, I'd love to hear from you in terms of, do you see the same in terms of this importance of integrating that value proposition in all of those different touch points, programs, policies across the organization? But also, have you managed to segment your value proposition in any way to reflect the different kind of parts of the organization, the different audiences within the population?
So I'll introduce myself first of all before I try and answer the question. My brain's still processing the second part of that question. My name is Tom State. I lead our talent acquisition teams at Microsoft for EMEA and Asia. So I do come at this with a bias. So cards on the table. Jared said not to be too recruitment focused. I am completely recruitment focused in my day job. That might show up in the way I talk about this topic. So I think in terms of, just to kind of provide context for us in terms of how we came to our EVP, I think we felt that we had a really good offering internally, and Jared talked about loads of really important things like being a purpose-driven organization, having consistent messages around things like purpose that creates unity across the organization. And we are a really big organization, and this is kind of half my brain's still trying to work out the answer to your second question, Gabby. We're a big organization that does a lot of different things. So we're like 200,000 plus people in 135 countries. So the company does talk to different audiences, exist in different communities, do different things. But we felt that and I guess a kind of a catalyst event for the way Microsoft is today is the appointment of our current chief exec. He's now been chief exec about 10 years. And when he came in, he drove a really significant culture shift across the organization, but also as a business, Microsoft changed, right? So we went from being a very traditional enterprise software company to becoming a cloud organization. And that didn't just mean we were selling a different product. It's a whole different way of working, particularly for our sales teams. They had to engage with customers differently. They weren't just going in and renewing a license. They were having longer term engagements. They were talking about, hey, look, don't just buy the product, but here's how to maximize it. Here's how to make the most of it. So as well as doing an organizational change around products and around process, we also had a culture change going on at the same time. And that had been a huge piece of work across the company. Satya particularly did a great job of leading on that as the overall leader of the business. But we'd got to a point where we had a really strong employee offering on that traditional piece, which Gabby, you were talking about and Imran talked about. So that kind of the benefits offering, the comp offering, we felt that was really strong. But we also had this culture story, which was really strong as well. And going on thinking about differentiators, if I think about the moment in time we really started going deep on our EVP, it was at that period when the market was extremely competitive, particularly in the tech space. The war for talent was particularly hot. We knew that culture was our principal differentiator. Our recruitment teams knew that and went out talking about it. Our leadership knew that and talked about it all the time in company all hands. It was through our company messaging. But it's like, if I think about your second question, Gabby, we were almost differentiating that too much. We were a big company. Leaders were given a lot of empowerment. So there were times when it would feel like that messaging didn't land in a consistent way because the gaming business would have a way of talking about it. The Azure business would have a different way of talking about it. It might show up differently in India to the way it showed up in the UK. So for us, a lot of our work on the EVP was actually starting with, we've got really good stuff and our employees are buying into it. We think that's our differentiator. People tell us that's why they stay and that's why they join. But actually a big part of it for us is actually how do we knit all those things together in a way that's more consistent for Microsoft as a global organization. And then I think the answer to your second part, Gabby, is we were We started in this quite sort of differentiated way. The journey was to become more consistent in terms of how we told the core story, while still acknowledging that Xbox is totally different to the rest of the business. So Xbox has to have freedom to, there are elements of its lived experience and its EVP which are different, and that's good. So we had to structure our EVP in such a way that we were like, here's the things that are consistent at a corporate level in terms of the offering, in terms of the culture, in terms of how we show up. But then here's the things that are, and they really are different if you're an Xbox versus in Azure versus in a software team in India, for example.
Yeah. Really helpful, Tom. And as part of that, consolidation around what the core was and where you wanted to be consistent, recognizing the need for those differences. Did you embed some of those core aspects in the, and this is a question, I don't know whether you have uniform kind of policies and practices and people programs across the organization that reflect those? Were they embedded in those kinds of ways to reflect the culture and the EVP that you were wanting people to experience?
So the honest answer is that yes, we do have common policies and programs, but were they consistently applied in practice? So they kind of, you've got policy versus practice. And I think that this work was one of the catalysts to go, there's real opportunity to become more consistent in the lived experience, because there's some really positive parts of the experience.
Yeah.
If we think about our listening systems, sometimes they clearly aren't showing up in a consistent way, depending upon where you are. And that might be a geo point of view, or it might be the org that you sit within. So it became a driver to become more consistent how we're applying those. And they were in some of our policies. It might be in some of our benefits provision. So obviously benefits provision is difficult to get completely consistent across the world, but we work to become more consistent. It was also definitely in terms of the way in which we, and this isn't like the branding part of it, isn't the main part of it, but both externally and internally, we didn't have one voice. It was a bit of a mess. Like everyone had their own branding they did and their own initiatives. And actually one of the things we started to do, which employees gave good feedback on, was that the branding we were using externally to communicate on all of these related topics, we started to make sure it was the same branding that we were using as an HR organization across things like our benefits provision. So when you might transition from, we're not quite there yet, by the way. It's amazing how long it's taken to refresh all this. You think, oh, that'd be really easy, but then you have so much real
big organization.
you have so many different places it pops up. So it's still a work in progress, in all honesty. But the dream is a scenario where, whether you're on the careers site, which could be internally or externally facing, whether you're on your local benefits, flexi benefits provision site, whether it's a piece of communication coming out from HR or on a related topic, that the look and the feel of that is consistent, as well as the cultural messaging being consistent.
Amazing.
That's still a journey, right? I don't want them to think we've nailed that. We haven't, but we are closer than we've ever been. So I'm optimistic. I think we'll get there. And the feedback from employees, it feels more important to employees than perhaps some of us expected, because it really has helped give them the impression that we are joined up, that things don't happen by accident, but all of these things which go to create your employee experience, that we recognize they are joined up and that we are intentional about that.
They're intentional. Yeah, that's just what I was going to say. That intention is the key thing, isn't it? And amazing. Thank you. And so, Kath, coming to you, how is that playing out in Amazon right now in terms of, are you doing similar things? Is that, are you seeing those lived experiences come to life? How are you bringing your EVP to life within Amazon?
Great question. Thanks, Gabby. It's interesting, really interesting listening to Tom, actually. So first, quick intro. I'm Kath Bossamai. I run talent acquisition as well. So similar job to Tom, but for EMEA, for Amazon stores. So that's the bit hopefully most of you think about when you think about Amazon. So the retail site you hopefully buy from, and the logistics bit that deliver your parcels really fast. I'm not responsible for AWS, which is our kind of cloud computing part. So in terms of answering the question, I mean, I've been in Amazon 3 years now, and before that worked in recruitment outsourcing for 20 years. So I've been inside lots of large organizations. And I think one of the things that has really impressed me and surprised me actually about Amazon, so I can take no credit for any of this because, this was done before I arrived. But one of the things that really impressed me for a company the size of Amazon, which is 1.5 million people, and that's permanent employees, not in counting our associate workforce. The consistency of the employee experience is phenomenal, and all of that is based upon a few things that that Bezos put in place when he was chief exec. Amazon has 16 leadership principles. Some of you may have heard these. I don't know. If you haven't, it's worth a Google. For a long time, there were 14. Now it's 16. There was a couple added recently. But really, everything, every kind of touch point in the company is founded on those leadership principles. So the way in which we recruit, and all the language used around recruitment, the way in which we promote, do performance assessment and evaluation, and the way in which meetings are conducted. You will frequently hear people quote at the Amazon leadership principles. So, an example would be, we have one called "Have Backbone, Disagree and Commit," which is my favorite. And because my last role before joining Amazon was working in the British Army, where I used to see the opposite, which is basically consent and evade, which is what I call the opposite. But "Have Backbone, Disagree and Commit" is all about, if you're in a meeting, we expect you to disagree. It doesn't matter how junior you are, how senior the meeting people might be, but we want you to have backbone and disagree. But when a decision is made and you walk out the meeting, you commit, whether or not you disagree. And everyone understands that. And so you'll frequently hear people say, okay, well, look, I'm going to disagree and commit on this one. And everyone knows what that means, and they do it, right? Which is a hugely enabling factor as an organization. So yeah, those leadership principles are absolutely integrated throughout. And yes, they're on our walls in every single office, right? But you expect that. And I've seen values written on the walls of every office in lots of other large companies that I've worked within. But really, they're just written on the walls in lots of cases. Whereas Amazon has managed to, achieve the difficult task of really, really living, breathing these leadership principles, and everyone understands it. Doesn't matter what level of the organization you're at, doesn't matter what country you're in, doesn't matter what business area you're in. So it's really, really consistent. So there's that, the leadership principles, and then some of the ways of working, which are also really kind of fundamental in terms of what an employee experiences and how they work. So again, some of you might have heard, I don't know, we have a document writing thing in Amazon. Very unusual. You hardly ever see a PowerPoint in Amazon. Meetings will start always, nearly, with a document being shared and 10 minutes or 20 minutes, depending how long the document is, of silence while everyone is reading the document. Which, coming from an external environment, feels strange to start with. But it's based on the principle that if you circulate the document beforehand, people are either too lazy or too busy to have read it. And if you read it in the meeting, then everyone is on the same, has the same equal level of knowledge. You can have an active discussion. And then we will talk through the document. Okay, and you'll get, so on line 33, you said this. What do you mean? So it requires discipline, because you have to be really explicit about what you're arguing, because you can't put a slide up and then waffle, basically, is the rationale. And then there are certain kind of other very Amazon phrases which everyone understands and go through the whole company. Talk about a lot about one-way door and two-way door decisions. One-way door decision being you can't come back through it, so make sure it's right, spend more time on it. Two-way door being, doesn't matter if we get it wrong, we can undo it, so get on with it, don't think too much about it. So there's lots of that is completely consistent. So I know, for example, if I was to walk into an AWS meeting in India, even though I might not know the subject matter, I would completely recognize and understand the way in which the meeting is conducted, the kinds of behaviors I would see, the expectations of me as a leader. And that, I think, is really powerful and really impressive in terms of, and obviously, all of the tools we use internally are built around those leadership principles in order to help embed those further. So, our recruiting system, when we interview and when we have a kind of panel feedback system, it's all against those leadership principles. Okay. Everyone understands that, and there's consistency in that as well.
Amazing. And Imran, it looked like you were going to add or ask something.
Just to jump in, there was an interesting parallel as I was listening to Tom and Kath. First of all, Tom, you mentioned about when Satya came in as CEO, there was a culture shift that he was looking to drive. And then Kath, you mentioned the leadership principles from Bezos. For WTW 3 years ago, we had a new CEO come to lead the company, and we embarked upon work to revisit our own EVP for our own colleagues. And so that it coming from the top was really important, and it's embedded throughout. And for us, it's being authentic, curious, and bold is where we landed. And now some elements, and I think this for us, I'm curious about others on the panel, for us, some of those elements of our EVP are grounded in who we are today, and they are representative of why we've been so successful up until this point. And then there are other elements that are more aspirational, and we know that. And so it's trying to get that right balance of who we are and who we're, and trying to be aspirational. So I'm just curious around just how you strike that balance around those two aspects, aspirations versus grounded in who you are.
Do you want to go first, Kath? Or shall I'll go.
No, you go.
I'll go, and you can think of a good
Go ahead, Tom.
If I think about it in our terms, so our company purpose and our company mission, I'd probably say it's the most used slide in the company. So it's probably the equivalent in some respect. It's not the same, but in some ways it's the equivalent to what Kath described from the Amazon leadership principles, in that it's there all the time. It runs through everything. And it's evolved over time, but it's remarkable how similar it is today to when Satya first shared it, like 10 years ago when he was first chief exec. So purpose is the thing which has remained incredibly consistent and becomes the kind of North Star for when you're making big decisions or when you want to understand something. When we talk about aspirational, a really important part of the Microsoft culture is how inclusivity and a commitment to D&I generally is at the center of it. And we talk a lot about our aspirational culture from that regard, in the sense that it's something that you never get to where you want to be from that perspective. And you know that it's something that you work at all the time, and equally that none of us are perfect. Even if you think of the most inclusive leader and you run your team and your organization the most inclusive way, you're never really truly aware of everything you're doing, and we all make mistakes, particularly under pressure. So we talk, and one of the things that came up earlier, I think Imran, it was you talking about your son. We operate in the external world context as well as our own very internal company context, right? So when a huge part of your company culture, like it is at Microsoft, is so rooted in inclusivity and a really strong commitment towards inclusion, and then globally, but particularly in the US, which is our home market, the external atmosphere and climate around is changing so dramatically. That becomes very fluid, and suddenly some of the conversations you've been used to having, maybe even some of the things you've been used to doing, they become more difficult to do because you're operating in an external context which has really fundamentally changed, and that's the context that your employees live in when they're not at work, right? So I think I don't know if I've answered your question, but if I think about what's consistent, it's purpose. It's amazing how consistent it's been. What's the bit that's aspirational? Most of the rest of it, but the bit we talk about mostly is our inclusive culture, and how are we tracking against it, and everything that relates to it, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, Tom, to your point about everything else being aspirational, it's always, to your point, a work in progress, isn't it? It's a long journey. However hard you're trying to embed things in the right way, to drive the right behaviors at every single touch point, it's not perfect, and it's a constant journey and a constant effort to keep reinforcing those behaviors and that value proposition that you want to see within the organization. So however hard you try, there's always going to be someone in the organization who probably disagrees that you're doing a fantastic job.
And if I might add, I think, to build on Tom's point, I think it's a really, really good one. I think particularly for global organizations like us, the increasingly volatile kind of global contexts is making life really hard. Because there's so much ambiguity, and what's happening in America is a good example. What's happening in the Middle East, we have employees in Israel, we have employees in other Middle Eastern countries, and that's tough. So being really true to what you hold dear around inclusion as an employer is increasingly a harder line to walk, but really, really important.
It is a really hard line to walk. Tom, were you going to add something?
No, I was just agreeing.
There's
one thing that's changed actually as a leader in a global business in the last 2 years. It's what Kath just said. I think it's obviously if you're in a global team that's multicultural in different countries, it's always there. But I guess the tightrope has got more difficult in the last 2 years to an extreme extent.
Yeah, no, it really has, and driving that consistency, that EVP takes agility on a regular basis, doesn't it? To adapt to the situation, to reflect the EVP or the culture or the employee experience in the right way, in the right moment, at the right touch point. Takes a lot of agility from leaders, particularly leaders and managers these days, I think. Amazing. Jared, were you going to add something? Otherwise, I'm going to come to another question.
No, just really quickly. I just wanted, it's really interesting to hear where, specifically Amazon and Microsoft, where you guys are in terms of building that culture and that EVP. The one thing that I think that that perspective-wise is a little different from our organization is that we are a relatively new organization in terms of being a public company. Where it's a 100-year-old company, but we just went public in 2018, and it's a company built largely on acquisition. So I think that when I think about where we are in building the value proposition, especially with the new CEO who's been here for about a year, and aligning the values across the acquired companies that all had their own culture, their own value propositions, and trying to pull those together. It's really interesting to see the types of things that have been implemented in larger organizations like an Amazon that have really kind of gotten you to the point where it feels like it doesn't matter where you sit, that there are understood and expected things that you'll experience as an employee. So that's really interesting to hear about.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And Jared, just going on to my next question, I'm conscious we're coming up to close on time. We're going to start answering some questions from our audience. In terms of organizations who, obviously the organizations that you all represent have fairly well developed and established employee value propositions, some which is working brilliantly, some which might still be aspirational. But if you were an organization that was at the point in their journey where they're considering developing a more defined, more articulated employee value proposition, what advice would you give them in terms of the key steps to take or the key watch outs to think about as they progress on that journey?
What
are your lessons learned? Yes, yeah, please, Kath, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, I can't claim to have had anything to do with Amazon's development of EVP, but I think some of the things that are really important, and these might be self-evident truths, but is, total authenticity. I mean, you can't pretend to be something you're not, for starters, and then, whatever you are presenting yourself as externally needs to absolutely match up with the truth of what someone finds when they join the organization. And I think that is, I'm teaching everyone to suck eggs here, as we say in the UK. But I would start with that. What is true first. And my last, I mentioned the army. When I was running recruiting for the army, we were thinking about how we were, it was a failing organization, quite famously in the British press at the time, and we were really thinking about how we could overhaul our external advertising and marketing. And what we started with was, what is the kind of core unique human truth about being in the army, which is going to be meaningful to the audience that we are trying to attract. And what was interesting, that in the past, everyone had defaulted to lots of glamorous adverts with guns and tanks and bombs and bullets and things, which obviously is part of being in the army, but it's not everything you do most of the time, thankfully for all of us. And actually, if that's how you advertise, then you're going to attract the 5% of people who always wanted to be in the army because they're interested in guns and tanks and bombs and bullets. And actually, what the universal human truth underneath it all was actually that being in the army is about belonging. And so we completely revamped all of our advertising. Long story short, we hit the recruiting target 2 years in a row. And so I think that's really important. You're going to really examine yourself hard in terms of what is the truth about working here, and how do we articulate that for our employees and our future prospects as well.
Yeah, no, really helpful. Thank you. Any last adds to the lessons learned for our participants before we go to some questions that are popping in?
I'm happy to share one of the lessons that we learned, which was that we're an American company, and America remains our home market and our biggest market by some distance. So therefore, a lot of this work was led out of the US. And even though we have a very multinational group of people working in HQ, it was amazing the first go round on how we tried to kind of create this message to someone who wasn't based in the US, how American it felt, and how it felt it was really talking to one particular audience. And we had to do quite a lot of work. And actually, we went back and we did a lot more listening, set up all over the world. And sometimes we couldn't go to every single country, but as well as going to the countries where we have a lot of people, like India and the UK, we also went specifically to some smaller countries to kind of get some, what's it like to be a Microsoft employee when you're in a country where we only have 50 people or 100 people, and got some different perspectives. And I think someone I can see in the IM has asked a question about how do you diversify your message? Well, I think what we try to do is try and find, and this is, I guess, builds on Kath's point about authenticity and what's the really core common truth for everyone. Be really clear about what is consistent about your employee experience, and you want to be consistent about your employee experience, and then build on that. And then there is some room outside of that if you're leading a team in a different locale, or you're running a business which has got its own distinct identity. Xbox is the obvious one to use. Then there can also be an additional layer of identity which relates to that on top of it. But the core enterprise-wide EVP, you have to work hard, especially globally, to try and make it as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I think, taking that core, but then thinking about how's that applied in the different markets, the different cultures, the different components of your organization is really important, and doesn't necessarily look the same. So although the emphasis might be the same, the way it's reflected and the way it's brought to life might look slightly different depending on the part of the organization or the geography. Really, really important. So I'm going to bring this discussion to a close and answer some of the questions that are coming into the chat, if that's okay. And the first one that came in is around, what are some of the strategies you've put in place to integrate into the organization? And Jared, I'm going to push that one to you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing about being able to integrate it really is about intentionality, right? Like, I think there has to be a plan. There has to be alignment on how you're going to roll that plan out. And for us, what we've found is that creating almost project-like action plans to make sure that we're tackling the gaps that we have has been really helpful. And it also creates a learning opportunity where those are being rolled out. So again, going back to what I had mentioned before is, integrating concepts into your BAU requires an understanding and a commonality of implementation across the board. And to do that, you kind of have to have an intentional plan to roll it out. And what comes along with that a lot of times is education on how to do that. So we spend a lot of time with managers, and we spend a lot of time with leaders, again, just moving this into the forefront of not just like a talent strategy, but really having it become part of our business strategy as well.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. I think that intentionality that both you and Tom have mentioned now is just such a critical part of that integration into the DNA of the organization, just the way the organization works. I think that's a really important point. So I think you started to answer, Tom, some of the next question, which is around adapting the EVP. How are organizations adapting the EVP to the 5 generations that are in the workplace now? And reflecting on Imran's introduction around his son coming into the workplace, and then you think about those who are coming to the end of their working lives. How are you working to adapt that EVP to reflect? You mentioned lots of listening. Are there other things that you're doing to try and reflect those 5 generations?
Yeah, I think there are some practical things we're doing, certainly in terms of benefits provision. If I think about the benefits that we provide and the extent to which we're supporting families in different ways than the way we used to, that's definitely a reflection of the variety of caring responsibilities people have, right? Which are really broad. Benefits provisions different in different countries, but the degree of flexibility that we've tried to provide is really kind of trying to recognize that when you are big, you do have this huge diversity from a generational point of view. I think the other area, which is an important part of our culture, is a degree of flexibility we have. So partly because of the nature of what our business is, we are facilitating everybody. I know we're on a Zoom platform at the moment, but normally Microsoft is providing the tools and the platforms to enable us to do these kind of virtual meetings and people to work remotely.
Indeed.
Therefore, we walk and talk that culture, right? We've had that since pre-pandemic, and so how you manage that culture in such a way that it can therefore support people at different points in their lives, that's an important part of it. And then when we think about how your EVP becomes part of your employer brand, for us, that's been an important part of how we talk to different groups externally as well. Look, we are a big company, but we've also got flexibility built into our culture, flexibility built into the way we support you as an employee. So I guess that's how we do it. But it's one of those things where we talk about it a lot. I'm not going to pretend that we've completely cracked it.
Yeah, I think just picking up on the word flexibility, I think that's key. And actually, there's been just a very small example, but there's been some recent changes in the United States that will allow for a defined contribution retirement plan and contributions going into that plan to be used not just for retirement, but for healthcare and paying down student debt. And so that choice allows for different generations to direct those contributions in the way that actually is relevant to their lives. And I think it's that word lived experiences, which I think you talked about before, Gabby, as well. So that's a practical example, I think, Tom, of your point around flexibility, which we're seeing more of.
Yeah, absolutely. Great answers. Moving on, I'm conscious of time. I want to try and get through as many of these questions as possible. There's one here around squaring the EVP with your commercial messaging and your commercial USP, where there are the potentially conflicting priorities. So the commercial priorities versus the internal messaging might be slightly at odds with each other. And the example given in the question is around, with inclusion messaging and fear on touching certain topics from a commercial point of view. Obviously this is something every organization is trying to balance effectively. But what suggestions would you give for how you might balance that EVP with that external commerciality? Anyone wanting to pick that one up? It's a big question.
It's a tricky one. I'm not sure if I'm properly understanding it necessarily. I suppose a good example of trying to balance those kind of conflicting tensions is things, Amazon has a big commitment to inclusion and diversity, as all organizations should and do. But we work in Saudi Arabia, where rights for women are different. And we have to operate within that country, but equally we want to try and advance the cause of inclusion. So women can't work alongside men. Okay, so we have female only delivery stations. So trying to, which actually, by the way, are more productive and far better and more efficient than our other delivery stations. Surprise, surprise, as she says, for the women. But I think so. I think where there's conflict, you've just got to be smart about how you stay true to your values as an organization. I'd offer that. Yeah, not easy.
Yeah, it's not easy, but great example, I think, of how you're balancing some of that. In terms of how you drive the organization forwards. There's one here, and I think, again, what we've touched on aspects of this, but in terms of ensuring that your EVP and your broader employer brand are aligned and connected to your corporate brand. Obviously, that feels like it comes through very strongly, Tom, from a Microsoft perspective. Kath, I don't know what your view would be from an Amazon perspective, and well, anyone want to take that question?
Hey, I'll give you. I think I've been quite positive about some of the things we do very well. Here's something we do really badly, and it frustrates the hell out of me. If you're lying in bed at night and you decide you want to buy a book, you can reach your phone and 3 clicks later it's arriving the next day. At the moment in Germany, for example, it takes 42 clicks to apply to a job in Amazon. And that, so our candidate experience is not anywhere near as good as our consumer experience, you know.
Yeah.
And that really jars, you know, that's
Yeah.
you know, and it's very, very difficult in a, you know, back to a huge global organization, a bit old Europe, trying to get traction to kind of fix some of that. It can be tough.
Yeah.
But yeah, we don't, you know, we definitely don't get that right in every situation, for sure.
Yeah.
I,
That's it. Sorry, Tom, carry on.
No, I was going to say, I'm not going to pretend we've got our candidate experience right, by the way, so I'm not going to go on to that point. But what I was, when I was thinking about what would be my answer to this, I think you know, we all, regardless of whether you're intentional about your employer brand, you obviously have an employer brand because people are aware of your brand as a company, particularly if you're Amazon or Microsoft, we're such big well-known companies. So I think and the employer brand comes first. It's the bigger, more powerful, pervasive brand. That's where, before somebody even thinks about joining Microsoft, they're aware of Microsoft as a consumer of products or awareness of the brand. So when you build your EVP, particularly the messaging around your EVP and you build your employer brand, it has to be done in reference to what your corporate brand is. Kath started off by saying the most important thing is to be authentic, and that's absolutely right. If you aren't authentic, and being authentic is just, you know, the two relate to each other and speak to each other. If you haven't done that, then it doesn't look believable to anybody from the outside, let alone from the inside. So yeah, so I think that that would be my answer to that. I think is that the company brand inputs into the way in which you grow your employer brand, and if you develop your EVP in a truly authentic way, then your employer brand reflects the employee experience and your company brand.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. I think we've got time for one last question. So I'm just going to keep flowing through so that no one feels like I've jumped their question out of the queue. So there's a question here with a bit of background, which hopefully all the panelists can see. The question to the panel is, given rising public media attention on health and well-being and increasing incidence of serious disease affecting working population, from an EVP perspective, do you see rising demand for more comprehensive medically led preventative healthcare programs in the UK EEA? I don't know, Imran, whether you want to pick up that one in terms of the aspect of the EVP.
I think and we've seen it in our data. We've got a pretty far-reaching study around global attitudes to global benefits across the world, and well-being features very prominently on the top concerns of employees. And it's not just physical. Increasingly, financial well-being is at the top of the list as well as emotional and social. So all of those aspects of well-being are being contemplated together, and I think it's the manifestation of the EVP as to in the policies, the processes, the programs that exist, that well-being is actually getting integrated there. So you take the EVP, you say, what does it mean in terms of programs, etc. And we're seeing more companies saying, how do we design and implement well-being programs to reflect the EVP? And I don't think it's just unique to physical. It is across these other dimensions of well-being.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And it has such an important part to play. And, you know, as we've talked about, the EVP encompasses so much of those and impacts so much on those touch points that you have as an organization with your employees. And it is way beyond, you know, just the physical aspects of well-being, and those critical touch points that managers and leaders have with employees impact on all aspects of well-being. So I fully agree with you there. I'm very conscious of time. Any closing statements, comments that any of the panel would like to make in conclusion to the discussion today? Anything that you feel we've not picked up on that you'd like to talk about just in the last minute before we move to close?
Maybe just a very quick comment. I would say that there is an ROI to getting this right. There is an absolute business return to achieving superior, whether it's employee experience, and EVP is a component of that, but there is an absolute business return, and this is why this matters.
What?
And probably if I was to build on that as well, I was just thinking about how when I first started talking, I talked about the period in which we were really working on our EVP was when the tech market was, or we first landed it, I should say, when the tech market was extremely competitive from a recruitment point of view. The market conditions now are really different, right? So there's still competition for the best talent, but I'm sure Kath's seeing the same with huge numbers of people applying for jobs, and we're recruiting less, and everyone's recruiting less. But what's interesting is that although we did all the work around our EVP and our employer brand when the market was in a very different state, the return on investment in that work we are still seeing now, because where we get that right, that means that we're able to speak in a more speak to the right group of people in the right way. So the payoff is different now to what it was 4 years ago. But to your point, Imran, that we're still getting a return on the time we invested in getting that work done.
Amazing. A great point. I think, you know, it just shows that as long as you continue to pay attention to that EVP and evolving that EVP, even though market forces changes, situations changes, you can continue to get that return, see the value of all of that work that you put in over a very long period of time. But I think it is important, to your point, to continue to evolve that EVP, because as we've seen and as you've all spoken about, you know, things are changing all the time, and therefore the experiences and the expectations of employees in the workplace, of different ages and different generations, are changing all the time as well. And so keeping that EVP fresh and keeping that EVP relevant, I think, is just absolutely critical. So I'm really conscious we're coming up to the close of the hour. I want to thank you all so very much for joining into the discussion today. I think it's been hugely valuable. Some great questions. Sorry we didn't get through all of them, but I won't promise to answer them offline, but you may well be able to pick up with people offline and get responses to those questions. So at that point, thank you again. I'm going to hand back to Tamara to close us out.
Thanks, Gabby. Yeah, it's just really my job now to say thank you so much to our fantastic panel, to Gabby, you for taking us through the hour, to everyone who spent time to join us today. It's so important that we have these conversations, and I'm glad we could do that today. We'll continue to host these conversations on employee value proposition, on inclusion. We actually have an in-person event in London in November on neurodiversity in the workforce. So if you'd like more information about that, please get in touch. Thank you all for joining, and have a great rest of the day.